So Natalie, you serve in a variety of NED roles as well as on boards, as do you, Ragan. But talk to me a little bit about when a founder should advance to setting up a formalized board with or without NEDs, and what is the decision path and what is the construct of that external advisory group?
In my experience, I think most boards tend to get formally structured at the point when external investment is coming in. So investors tend to implement or insist on some form of board structure. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but also in my experience, I've tended to find that in joining a board, there are already non-executives on that board. Some of them in early stage businesses tend to be people they trust and who may not necessarily bring industry experience to the table. They might bring a specific, it might be a subject matter expert, in finance, for example. That would probably be one of the first things that a founder might bring in. But also, just to Ragan's point, bringing advisors who are part of the team together. So if I think about some of the med device companies that I work with, bringing subject matter experts, global world leading experts, in gastroenterology or respiratory, for example. And that can really add weight, not just for the investment story, but also for your customers, but also for you as the founder and as a sort of a fairly young team needing to lean on some real strength and expertise and years of experience. And so, you're really evolving, I think, from that into setting up your first board. And of course, that does vary depending on who the investors are and what typically comes along with that. But you definitely need to think about how to structure a board. And you also need to think about how that board structure may change over the lifetime of the journey, if you like, the growth journey, because the board that you start with is not necessarily the board you're going to need or are going to be useful to you at sort of year 3, year 5. And, I'm generalizing here. Some people on the board can definitely stay that journey, particularly if they've done they're subject matter experts, or they're bringing industry expertise or growth trajectory expertise to the table. So, but as a general rule of thumb, when you're starting your board, you have to think about how that board is going to be structured and what's going to be useful for you as well. There's perhaps lots of things to avoid.
Yeah, cover them.
So I think one of the things that typically, if I look at a board that a business has, they've just secured external investment or they're a couple of years in, one of the biggest issues I find is that there's a complete lack of independence. And this can be quite common on private equity boards, actually, and VC boards to some extent, where you tend to have representation from every investor. So you've got too many investor directors and no independence, or not enough independence. So the first thing for me that I think is really important is to bring some independence to the table. And I think having a chair on your board from an early stage is actually quite important too, because that is a real opportunity for you to have a mentor and someone that can help navigate that sometimes tricky journey with the investors. You're not always going to be aligned, and the independent piece is important, but that's a typical chair role where you're supporting the chief exec and helping them, but you're also there to support the investors. Sometimes you've got to push back a little bit, but often what you're doing is you're the collaborator between both sides, and hopefully you're bringing that cohesion together. There are definitely tricky moments when you sit in the chair, but you've navigated those. I've certainly navigated quite a few myself as a chief exec and founder. So there's a really important role for the independent to bring to the table, both for the investors but also for the chief exec and the management team. So that would be a good example to start with, I think.
Ragan, continuing this view of an advisory group and a board, give me some examples. Let's say it's a company that has a technology in the real world evidence space. What would be some typical functionalities that you would seek as a founder in your set of advisors and eventually a board?
Well, I think it's a good distinction to make, in that that worth calling out is there's the set of subject matter experts who could serve as advisors on your advisory board, and then distinct from that, to the point that Natalie was mentioning, at what points in time does it make sense to form a formal board, is that the board is intended, the non-advisory corporate governance board is intended to serve as the fiduciary, which sometimes can be there can be tension around the strategic points of view around how the company decisions need to be decided upon. And at the earliest stages, there also seems to be at times where the advisory board is conflated as the accountability board, which frankly is not their role, and is a misappropriate use of their time, and how you should actually be thinking about bringing in a set of stakeholders that, again, are the fiduciary and who you're going to be accountable to as the CEO. And so, to the question of what are some of the functionalities, using the example of, let's say, a tech-enabled RWE innovative business or business model, is it comes back to what are the anticipated milestones that you're out to market for the next 12, 24 months, 36 months. So in the next 2 to 3 years, and then how do you enable the set of, again, capital investors and or board members who can help get the company there, based on the network they have, based on the portfolio companies they have that your solution could be able to add value to. I mean, I think that at the earliest stages, where we don't want to see too large of boards, because you as the CEO then have to manage the board members and competing points of view. And so it's to really think about how do you, to Natalie's point, how do you allow the composition to grow with you on the journey around, hey, we don't have this functionality and expertise either in-house or even on the advisory side, and it's not represented at the board level. And so to be able to engage with your board members and say, this is a blind spot for us as a company, and me as the CEO is calling this out as a risk. Are you able, fiduciary, to help us augment this capability or augment this functionality? And I think that the board composition, depending on the flavor and persona of the board member, they'll either be honest with you, or they'll be or they won't be. And again, that's what can help or disable the business, in terms of just removing the ego from the room. And for instance, using an example that for one of the companies that I've sat on our board before, or sorry, for one of the portfolio companies that we've had previously and sat on the board, that there comes a stage that there's the opportunity, there may come the stage that there's an opportunity for a strategic acquisition. And so thinking through, hey, what are the set of resources that we need to augment our expertise, but also recognizing that from, again, coming back to that fiduciary, there's the fiduciary responsibility that we can't just substitute one expertise in for someone else or for myself who doesn't have the expertise. So instead, it's about how do we augment that? How do we augment it versus replace? Or again, down the line for the journey, those are the hard but necessary conversations to have when a board member is no longer serving the best interest of the company. Then you have to engage with other board members to determine, hey, what's a succession or transition plan here? And I think that's where, again, as the CEO and founders, that you want to be able to be as honest as possible with your board, so that they can help mitigate the risks that you're concerned about, versus withholding critical information that they're driving or flying and directing you blind. And that tends to be, coming back to the earliest points of the conversation that we've had, and how do you qualify the investors that you want to work with, you could start to tease out the rapport piece. But again, to Natalie's point earlier, is there are investors that show up in one manner pre-check writing, pre-investment, and that same investor may show up differently post-investment. And so this is where, to be able as a founder entrepreneur to leverage the ecosystem resources and talk to founders who have taken capital from investors and find out, how did they show up or how did they not show up in the boardroom, and to do your homework, do your research from that point of view as well, because that's going to be critical in your darkest hours. That's going to be who is fiduciarily responsible for being there, and you need to make sure that they can be there with you in the trenches.
More often than not, the answer is no to funding or investing. When one gets a no, what should a founder do with that? And how can they turn that no into a better pitch? How can they establish a flow of information that helps them move to a better next stage? Natalie?
Getting a no is highly likely for any founder looking for investment. It's inevitable, in fact, and actually it's a really good learning opportunity. And if you do get a no, I think there's two aspects to it. Is it an absolute no, or is it a not yet? Because to me, they're very different. And I think that this is a really helpful phase. And actually, we're going through this with one of our investments at the moment. It's really helpful because actually it's more not yet rather than no completely. So that it's really good to determine between the two. No's are powerful because what you should be able to deduce from that, most investors will tell you why it's a no, and sometimes it's just not the right investor. Maybe you didn't do your homework, or maybe suddenly they've made an investment in a similar or competitor product you didn't know about. But often a no is a no, and it just means you need to find maybe there's nothing in there other than that. It could be simple reasons. It may be that you just didn't pitch it very well. And trying to get that kind of feedback out of investors who say no is perhaps not quite so obvious. But I do think you need to ask as much as you can and be open to really honest feedback from those investors. Ask them, how did we pitch? What was it about the pitch that was good? What was it about the pitch that was not so good? And maybe just try and eke out some of those questions to make sure you've got as much feedback out of them as possible. So determine if it's a no or a not yet. And the not yet is really very helpful because that gives you opportunity to go back and improve your pitch, or come back at a stage where you've checked one of their additional boxes that you didn't meet this time around.
Ragan, you've brought up the term authenticity is so important in your estimation from some of those early connection points. On the other side of the foot, is the investor also showing up authentically, and how can you lean into that?
Yes, well, I think that investors still, the investor sentiment or sentiment toward investors is that we take a pretty predatory point of view, and the stereotype exists for a reason, but that in terms of, so the point being then that there are going to be many investors who are not going to lead and engage you with authenticity. And so it's up to you to decide whether you would like to spend more time with that type of group or that type of persona, and to recognize that there are the counter type of investor groups who are trying to enable great businesses run by even better, run and being built by even better founders, or good businesses being run by great founders. And so it really comes back to being able to engage and suss out what impressions are you getting with your brief interactions with these investors, and to figure out the portfolio companies that they're already invested in or that they've maybe been able to be successful with, is there's no harm and no foul in reaching out to founders and operators who have worked with the investors that you want to engage with, or that you think may be able to be value add to you. So to ask questions and get reviews, because there's no Yelp for investors, to the extent that I'm aware, and even on the, as we know, that reviews typically get written on the on the ends, that even for those that reviews may be incredibly poor, it's also the context matters in terms of who did that review come from, if you have a competing view that the investors have actually been value add. And so I think it's really about the partnership, the commitment, and the terms of the capital, and thinking about what is this a 3-year relationship? It's never going to be a 3-year relationship. It's going to be much longer than that. And how do these groups, again, in the limited interactions that you're having, how a way that you can capture some early sentiment and discretion really is the thoughtfulness of their questions. Like, are they actually asking intellectually curious questions around your business, around the area that you know better than we do as the simple-minded investor, and simple-minded from the perspective of, we're having to understand your business without the nuance, and so we're needing to take away the jargon and strip that back. And so if they are, if you can start to assess or evaluate different investors based on the questions that they ask, I think you can tease out who you would like to spend more time with, because it's a reflection of the type of value. It's an indicator of the type of value that they might be able to bring to you and your company.
Natalie, let's go to you with digging down into some of the nitty gritty. Let's talk a little bit about due diligence. I know you conduct a lot of this for some organizations, private equity groups, and it's one of your favorite things to do. Can you really level set what is due diligence for founders that may not have a sense of what the construct of that looks like, and what should founders be prepared for?
Okay, due diligence, it's a very big topic of conversation, and it involves multiple players, where fundamentally it's an external view of your business model and the world in which your business model functions, operates. Depending on the size of the deal, you could be on a deal with multiple consultants, investment banks. You could be involved at the operational side, challenging management or asking questions of management. So you get to meet the team themselves and start to dig a little bit deeper into management with specific questions, but also looking at how they might respond to questions. And you're being asked to get a feel for team dynamic, competence, all of those kind of things. You can be part of a much larger team where you're only exposed to a portion of the due diligence. And this goes across every aspect: commercial, financial, legal, regulatory. So there'll be a lot going on behind the scenes. Everyone will be giving a different perspective and a different opinion, subject matter experts like me. Sometimes the due diligence that I might do might be really early stage. So when a founder is in front of an investor, maybe it's a process that's running, there'll be a lot of due diligence they will have already done. Typically today, when that process sort of starts more formally as well, the companies that I work with, most of them VC-backed companies, are establishing their data room. They've already got one. They're just enhancing it, and they operate with it. So they're adding to the data room as and when they need to, so that they're already prepared for the diligence that's going to take place. And that's fairly typical, I would say, with venture-backed businesses. Ragan's perspective might be really helpful. But often investors will do an incredible amount of research based on your business model. There's only so much they can determine from you, and they're going to be asking lots and lots of questions. It's very tiring, time-consuming for teams, and it can be quite draining. And if you're part of a broader management team, it can take time, and that can also distract you from running the business. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And the ante gets up the longer that the closer you get also to the deal being struck, because if the checks are going to be written, everyone's going to want to double check. So it's an arduous process. I mean, when you've come out the other end as a founder or a chief exec, you can think to yourself, that's been a great learning curve. If you're going into it for the first time, it's anxiety inducing. The onus is on you, particularly the founder. There's a lot of pressure on you from all angles. But what I would say is, if you know your business really well, you're confident in your numbers, and you really believe in the future that you're painting, that will come through in the diligence as well. If you're solid about all of those things, that's part of the process for the investors to have confidence in you building the business that they're about to invest in.
Ragan, what have you learned over the course of going through this process with multiple companies, and what are some tips that you would offer for founders?
Yes, some tips that I would offer founders with the due diligence process is to ask what the expectation is from a timeline perspective of how long does it take your firm to typically run its diligence process. So again, that gives you an indicator on the other side, or an indication on the other side around at what are the stage gates that you need to start getting signal versus spending time with other groups, right? And this comes back to so tip is to ask what is your typical diligence process? Are we talking 2 weeks? Are we talking 4 to 6 weeks? Are we talking a quarter or something completely beyond reason? And so then to build off of what Natalie was saying around setting up the data room, is that there are typically a core set of materials that investors are expecting to see, right? It spans financial, regulatory, legal, and corporate governance. And then from there, it's really about the point of view that the investors are wanting to understand a little bit more nuance. And so we're going to be requesting different types of material. And some of the material you're going to be on the hook for building de novo. But also it's a matter of, can you ground your understanding and why the investor is asking for this material, because you might actually have some other collateral that could speak to why we're asking you to put together something that you hadn't yet put together. And I think it again comes back to your ability and how the questions and lines of questions that are being sent over your way or being asked, if the management team is meeting with the investors, is from the investor point of view, we're trying to de-risk the opportunity, and with limited information under non-infinite time, right? And recognizing how do you show up, to Natalie's point, and exuding and demonstrating competency and confidence with regard to how well do you know your business, how well do you understand the market that you're after, and what are the learnings in between, and does the set of artifacts and materials that you've been able to build to date reflect the narrative that you're sharing. And so that's really, it's about packaging it into consumable information, some of which is, the dense market research is there. And so we're trying to validate, do we agree with how you're seeing your point of view?
When you said consumable information, it makes me smile a little bit. Of course, coming from a research background, completeness and depth are ingrained in my DNA. And my advisor kept triggering me in this process. Enough is enough, Patti. I really wanted to. I really wanted to demonstrate the depth of the fact that I had already thought about this and I had all of this ready to go, but it was too much, And so there's both sides of the equation to think about, right?
Exactly. But too much in that context, right? Because in another context, we might say, hey, Patti, please tell me more.
True.
Exactly.
Natalie, you work across several geographic locations with due diligence. Does it differ at all?
I'm not sure it differs per se. I haven't recognized any specific differences. I think that there's a general perception about the way US investors operate versus British investors, for example, particularly in the VC space. I don't think it's that different geographically. I just see it. I just see a difference in size of between PE and VC. So I don't really see that many differences. And maybe the structuring of deals, the way that the investors work together, that might be slightly different. But in general, I think that there's especially today, most investors are, particularly in PE, are broad investors. And we're also seeing a lot of American investors looking very closely at European business models, whether they have US presence or not. So I think we've just seen a different behavior and different ambition from investors, but I don't think the way they conduct diligence or evaluate business models is that different, not in my experience anyway.
Well, tell me more about the differences in behavior and maybe the type of deals and how they would structure. How does that specifically differ geographically?
Oh my goodness, that's a really tough question, Patty. I have to say, I just think it really depends on so many different factors. There's some general perceptions I think I can probably allude to. If I look at med tech in particular, there's an awful lot of activity in the European market at this point in time. And there's a lot of real smarts in this part of the world as well as in the US, right? There's some major advances in some European countries that perhaps are different from what's going on in the US. So it's a rich pool today. Broadly, the marketplace is much broader than it used to be. And I think that the perception, if you're a UK business looking for funding, I think you see the perception is there's more money to play with in the US, that the check sizes are bigger and valuations can be greater. There's speed and efficiency to getting deals done. And I think that there's generally a lack of bureaucracy. These are general perceptions. And I don't want to convince the audience that is absolute. Okay, these are generalizations, and I think they're generalizations at a time where we've seen a major shift in investing in healthcare. So I think we're seeing if we're looking at innovation generally in healthcare, there's all sorts of challenges in every health system across the world. So even though the US is still an enormous market and it functions differently, when you look at technology, you've got to be looking at how a piece of technology can apply to the US patient as well as the British patient and the German or French patient and all the French and German patients. So I think there's more of a global ambition today, which I would say is different to what it was like, 10 years ago, for sure. I think you definitely see that sort of dividing line in the Atlantic. In general, I mean, of course, the bigger funds are different, but in general, in sort of mid-market private equity, they'd probably stay in the US versus venture into the European market. Today, I don't think that's the case. And vice versa, you see a lot of European private equity firms, building, they're in Shanghai, they're in New York and, San Francisco. So I don't think it's the process that's different per se, but there's definitely more opportunity for investors to for founders to appeal to international investors. I think that's a big change versus what it was like a few years ago. But I don't think the process of investing per se is any different. I think that there's still going to be strong due diligence, maybe more so with an American investor who will, in my experience, insist on FDA approval, for example, before they really engage or before they want to invest in a European technology. There are some nuances to that and maybe some exceptions, but in the main, that's what we see.
Uh, do you think that, in your experience, that let's say a founder went through the acquisition process of their company, I had read that about 80% of founders were disappointed uh, after the acquisition. Does that jive with your experience, Ragan? And how are we getting that so wrong? Why is it? Why does that happen?
Well, I guess it comes back to the acquisition process itself is, from the point of view of it's nice to feel wanted before the deal is done, and it's a semblance or an indicator of, wow, I've spent so many blood, sweat, and tears building this up to a point that now someone else believes it's worthwhile, or someone else who wasn't a part of the journey to get us here believes it's worthwhile. I think that once a founder, always a founder. So then post acquisition, you have, depending on the terms that come with it, you lose autonomy and control, and you don't have the board that you built the relationship to get you to that point. And so that tends to be in conflict with what initially seemed like an accretive or value add integration that in reality people are challenging. And so I think that that's probably where the sentiment tends to arise from. But that with that said, there does remain the opportunity that post acquisition, for you to think through again what terms are at the table with regard to how long you're required to be with the new organization or new company or new buyer, and there are pluses and minuses there, but that, and then the maybe one final takeaway on this question is, perhaps you gain more information around the value of the deal wasn't as good as you thought you could have gotten based on new information. And that's, we can't predict the future based on history, but certainly we learn more in the future as we go along. And so that could also be playing into some of the experience that we see with founders who have had the fortunate opportunity to get acquired or have that particular milestone, because in another audience, it also is value add, regardless of what the number is. It is meaningful to early stage investors that you've gone through a process to mature an asset to a state of someone else was interested, right? And so I think there's, to the extent of in the arenas that you may feel less satisfied, if there's an opportunity that you could reflect on the success of what it was to repackage it to the area that you want to get back into, that it very much is still an accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. That's a really excellent final point. Natalie, what do you have to add to that, if anything?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I agree with everything that Ragan has said, but in a nutshell, you got a new boss. It doesn't matter if you've maintained majority stake, right? You've got a new boss. It's as simple as that. And that comes along with greater scrutiny, less autonomy, less blue sky, more rigor and detail. Focus on the bottom line. And healthcare, I think some of these businesses are very altruistic, and as they should be, but suddenly you've got these investors who've come in, it's bottom line, bottom line, bottom line. And sometimes that can be a real disconnect, particularly for employees who weren't involved in the process, who maybe don't understand what external investors are like. They don't really know what they do. And they've been used to having this, a dynamic boss who's, just someone that they really look up to and admire. And suddenly there's a different structure in the business, and things change. There's professionalism, there's structure that wasn't there before. Governance is a, corporate governance is a big thing. It just changes the dynamic of the business in many ways. And there's a lot you can do over time. I think setting expectations at the time of the deal, we talked about that earlier in this piece, but making sure you know what to expect on day one. Once the deal's been done, don't ask on day one, right, what happens now? You've got to be having that conversation with your investor director. What's the cadence that we need, that you're expecting in the business? Let's get all of that set up and established. Let's make sure the business understands what needs to change or what needs to happen. And of course, it depends on the culture of that investor. I said before, you might get a different personality coming in. You might get a different investor director whose behavior is very unculturally appropriate, if that makes sense, or it's just a different culture. So I think the other thing to say, I think, with some market access businesses, the real world evidence businesses of a certain size, and in the medcom space as well, a lot of the acquisitions that have been made, there's an earn out for those founders, and so they've been their own boss all this time, and now they're kind of an employee in a way, and that sounds like a negative thing to say, but it's the best way I can describe the difference between being the founder and the driver of the business. You might still need to be that person, but you might not necessarily be able to do it in the way you did it in the past.
Yeah. So many founders are accidental entrepreneurs. And I know that each of you work with researchers who had a good idea, turned it into a company, but then they are still researchers at heart. They're still scientists. Ragan, you alluded to your scientist DNA. That's hard to excise from one's body, regardless of what your new obligations are. But one of the things that I think challenges a good many of founders is, if they've had the good fortune to establish a business, is how to scale it from that 0 to 1 and 1 to 100 stage. And the investor has to work over and over with these sticky situations of helping those founders scale. What are some of those challenges that you've experienced on that side of the aisle? And could you highlight some pitfalls or avenues to success for founders that are in that scale up opportunity with funding?
Sure. So I think, in thinking about what are some of the challenges and pitfalls and how to overcome going from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 100, is that is that the same set of practices that got you from 0 to 1 are not what's going to unlock the execution needed to scale. And so then it does come back to who are you hiring into the organization to augment who's had the experience to take now going from 1 to 100. And I think that, this sometimes can be a blind spot by founders, including taking the point of view and reflection around, hey, am I still the best person in the CEO role to take the company? Now, this is going to be with a great board. There's going to be the right types of conversations that are influencing, you got this company here. Now we might need to bring in additional competency and expertise, and to receive that with humility, because again, it's in the best interest of scaling the organization. But I know that also can be a point of pride where, wow, it seems like I'm being left to the curb here, or dropped off. And so with that said, some coming back to, the challenges around what got you from 0 to 1 aren't absolute to be able to execute from 1 to 100 in scale, and that it's critical to be able to be speaking with your board, advisors as well, around, hey, what worked well in this market, and how to and that to use that to your advantage from a leapfrog perspective, versus sitting there and saying, well, we know we need to solve this, but we're still just looking at each other, asking each other how to solve it. So really think about, how do you bring different voices into the room? And again, recognizing that as the founder, as the executive team, you're mired in how do we survive, and sometimes aren't able to take as much time as you should to take a step back and say, hey, what are our blind spots organizationally that now could actually get us to the inflection point that we can see it out there, but what do we need to get there from an execution and operational perspective?
Yeah, you've built a strong relationship with your startup board, and it can seem so very daunting to change the construct of that as you move into the next stage. Natalie, do you have anything to add? And also maybe you can talk a little bit about board communication styles.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a few comments to what Reagan's already said really well, actually. I mean, I think the point of having a board is right there, and having a board to rely on and help navigate some of those challenges. I think if you're the founder, the minute you're bringing in additional or new investors or investors for the first time, as we just said, right, your business changes. You're not the only person that's in charge. It then becomes an organization that does require a level of collaboration in order to move it forward, because you've got to operate in the best interest of all shareholders at this point.
Yeah.
And I think one of the hardest challenges for any board and the founder is exactly the point that Reagan made about the change of team, and that often and can typically mean that as the founder stroke CEO, you need to take a step aside, or you need to find a different place in the organization, which is really difficult, or you've got to transfer into a sort of board position, or not. So I think that's a conversation that needs to be had with the investors on the way in as well. And if it's early enough stage, it's likely that you're going to, they're investing in you. So your journey is going to be a good few years ahead. But it's worth thinking about what the plan is that you're embarking on together, and thinking about those inflection points of management change or nuance. So I think that the advantage of having a board, going back to the board, is that is helpful for investors. It's great having a chair who can sort of navigate some of that conversation. And it's great for the chair to know where they stand from a board point of view, what the conversation needs to be, and where they're going to stand up to what's being discussed. So, putting a board in place, having the right kind of board, and this independence that I talked about earlier as well, I think is vital, because you can't. It's unusual, I think, to say that the team that you invest in, let's say the term of the investment is 5 years. If you look at some of these dynamic tech businesses, they probably need a bit more experience over the next few years. It depends on the founder's experience too, and we see that in some of the med tech businesses. They're really, as you said, there's scientists, they're engineers, they're doctors. This is where board composition is fundamental, and augmenting the lack of experience in that team, particularly commercially. You can build that within the structure of the board, and you don't need another 20 people, but bringing some of that expertise to the boardroom table can really help the team navigate those challenges, but also get through some of those tricky hurdles where you haven't got the experience in the management team. But you have to realize that there needs to be potentially a different team and a different board at various stages of a business's growth. So I think you've got to be open to that the minute if you've grown your business, the challenges, the next stage is going to be harder and different and bigger and deeper. So you're going to need some help.
And one thing I would add to that comes back to the earlier questions we were speaking to around how to evaluate the different VCs, is to recognize that the board members themselves are going to have different incentives based on the type of investment and the size of their fund. So concretely, for example, a first-time fund that has made an investment is going to be influencing decisions differently than patient capital, or capital in the sense that has a longer time horizon to be able to seek an exit. And that tension and competing points of views and influence can certainly play out, and often do play out in the boardroom in a way that you weren't necessarily accounting for, that dynamic that then you as the CEO or you as the executive management team then have to manage, again, sometimes to the deficit of what your vision is for moving the company forward. So the key point is recognizing what are the expectations, the return expectations for the different board members based on the types of funds that they're investing out of.
Natalie, have you had any experience with a board and a CEO/founder where there was a mismatch in the type of communication, the depth of communication that happened, that you could describe for our audience as sort of essential components for a CEO founder to operate in a way that really maximizes the board being able to be as effective as possible?
Yes, look, I've been on a number of boards over the years, and in the majority of cases, they've been really great experiences. And one of the things that is enjoyable about being a non-executive is working with, up and coming founders, working with, smart people who've built a business or are leading a business and are dealing with all of those challenges. I mean, founding a business in itself is that's a talent, and not everybody can do that. Most of the time it can be really rewarding for both parties, but the factors for founders are that they need to be receptive to feedback. They need to respect other people's opinions, and they need to be really transparent with their board. They particularly need to be transparent with, the chair, if there's the non-exec that is their sort of guide and mentor and coach. That can be that has to be an open, it has to be a really honest relationship and a trusting relationship, because sometimes you might need to have really direct conversation with one another, but that conversation needs to be tempered with the rest of the board, for example, or with the investors. But nobody likes surprises, and at the end of the day, this is a professional structure, it's a professional relationship, and the board is there for governance purposes. It has fiduciary duties, everything that Ragan mentioned earlier. That is the role of the function of the board, and that is if you're a director, most of the time as a chair, for example, I'm a director of the company, and it's really fundamental that you have a strong and trusting relationship with the founder stroke CEO. And I've definitely been in a situation where that trust was misplaced, and it led to some very tricky, difficult situations that actually were not good, wasn't healthy for the company. Wasn't healthy for the company, and in fact in another organization as well. You can be dealing with quite tricky founders, and actually sometimes that can be the reason why investors won't invest, because they can see that founder is going to be very difficult to work with. They're not open to feedback, and they're certainly not going to be transparent. There's nothing worse than surprises, and it's not just financial, but investors don't need nasty surprises. So you can't tell them one thing one day, and then of course there are always unexpected things, but certainly not around financial projections or anything of a legal nature. So yes, I've definitely been exposed to really difficult founders and fantastic founders, and I think that as a Ned, you have to make choices as much as investors do about who you want to work with, and where you want to spend your time. So founders, and it's hard for founders, they are, as we've said, it's no longer your business. It's not just about you anymore, but you're very close to it. It's your baby. So a lot of this sort of what I would call bad behavior probably comes from a lack of experience, a lack of understanding. But sometimes we're dealing with naivety, sometimes it's ignorance, and sometimes it's arrogance. And our job is to determine which it is.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Let's move to some final thoughts. I'd like for each of you to wrap up with 3 main takeaway messages for founders and investors in this arena. Ragan, let's start with you.
My 3 main messages for founders and investors in this arena is to do your diligence on the investors that you want to pitch with. Find warm connections for warm intros. Mm-hmm. And ensure that your pitch is consumable and digestible to a naive audience. You know your business better than anyone else. Help us appreciate that.
Beautifully said. Natalie.
Those are great takeaways. I'm going to try to be as eloquent and as smart. go into the process with open eyes. Just do as much as you can to understand the process that you're about to undergo. It can be a fantastic experience, and a lot of us have come out of the other end and have really gained so much value and importantly grown amazing businesses. So but be open to the challenges. And I just want to remind you, the good, the bad, and the ugly, my little analogy, this is an uncomfortable alliance. And if you remember that, you need to plan, right? So plan for that uncomfortable alliance, and then you're probably going to be very prepared. And finally, set expectations very clearly with the investors you're going to work with. Make sure that you're all aligned going into this deal before you sign all the paperwork. Know what to expect as a founder from day one, and know what your obligations are. And make sure from an investor point of view that you set this team up for success. Give them the support they need, and make sure that the board isn't stuffed full of people that aren't going to be particularly helpful. Was that more than 3, Patti?
It was fine. Well, we've come to the end of today's conversation, and I think it's been incredibly rich and informative, and built on a depth of experience that both of you bring to the table. I want to thank you so much, Natalie Douglas and Ragan Hart, for being so transparent and authentic, and providing us with some really good tips and tricks, no matter what side of the aisle one sits on. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great to spend time with you as well, Ragan.